Hello, and you're welcome to this introduction to Substance Designer. Now, this is going to be the theoretical introduction to this course. So, we're not going to be building any materials yet. We're not going to be building any textures. This is just a quick refresher, especially if it is your first time getting to see Substance Designer. You're trying to understand what the software is, what are the key terms and terminologies used in the software. We'll be looking at that as well. And I'll be opening up Substance Painter as well and try to show you the comparison and what you should understand before you fully take advantage of the software and begin creating simple materials. Then later on, when you're more experienced, you could jump into creating advanced materials. So what exactly is Substance 3D Designer? And Substance 3D Designer, simply put, is a physically based rendered texture creating software. Whoa, that's a lot of words, but trust me, they're easily understood. So, what is a PBR material? Because I said Substance Designer is a physically based rendered software that you can use to create textures. So these are what are textures, and then what does physically based render mean? So here I have a scene with a simple rock, parametric rock setup, and you can actually see the background right here. This is an HDRI image that ships with Substance Designer, and in this view you can actually see this image right here. Like I said, this is not a tutorial, it's just an explanation. But if you want to kind of like look at this, you can click on environment. That's why I click on edit, and I can see this in the properties window. So basically, this object we created right here is using this light setup of an external environment. If I should change this light setup, basically if I go over here in the environment, I can change the environment that we have built in and switch it up to another environment. We can go to the library and go to, let's see, PBR view, 3D view. Here we can actually see all these environments. Let's open it, HDRI environments, and we could just see each of these environments we're working with, like so. So this scene right here is being lit by this HDRI image. I can actually turn the angle, you can actually see these lights. So it means if you're creating this texture, if you're creating this material, you don't need to create a different material for a night scene, a light scene, or a dark scene, or a scene in a cave. If you create a material, you're creating a material that will react to the lights that have been provided in the scene. So this is going to save you a lot of time because you do not need to remodel an asset and set up the lighting for those assets. Back in the days, if you create a 3D model or you create your UVs and you create textures by painting them or importing them from images, if you just change the light setup of that environment, what's going to happen is that you're going to kind of like need to remodel that environment. So basically you have a material that responds to the lighting of your scene. And again, like I said, these maps, these textures you create are going to be exported. So right here we can see we have the base color, we have the normal map, the roughness map. I'll just go ahead and click them over here. So we have our base color, which is just a neutral color. This is the normal map. This is the roughness map. This is the ambient occlusion map. And this is the height map. So basically what you're doing with Substance Designer is creating these maps parametrically. Now, parametry is a keyword in Substance Designer because a parametric map simply means you're not hand painting or adding textures using a brush. You're just using numbers, sliders, values, floats, variables to create these sliders using default built-in assets. Now, if we look at here in the library, these are the default assets. Apart from these nodes called the atomic nodes. Now, I actually said a node. So what actually is a node, right? Say a node is a pre-built setup that contains parameters. Basically, lots of values you can change. Some nodes you cannot create from scratch. Other nodes only provide outputs. The atomic nodes are these nodes right here at the top, and if I press the space bar, you can actually see these base atomic nodes. Basically, you cannot create them, but rather they exist and are used to create other node types. Now, the two most common node types, if I go over here to here, are the texture generators. So let me just go ahead and hold shift and space bar, and then what I'll do is to maximize this view. I'll just use large icons, and these are texture generators. They're classified into two, or grouped into two. We have noises and we also have filters. We have noises and we have patterns. A noise is much more chaotic, it's natural, and it looks more organic. It doesn't have a preset order. So these are noises, and a noise or a generator only has an output. You cannot create a noise and have an input for that noise. A noise only has an output. Noises are natural, patterns are much more man-made and look artificial. So if we look at this, and one key thing about Substance Designer is that before you start making these group of nodes, if for instance you want to create a wood texture, you can actually begin to look into the texture generators and look at which noises kind of like start looking like wood, so that it gives you an idea of how you can create these assets. So again, these are the noise sets. These are all the noises that come shipped in. We can actually see the caustics look like water surface, right? Water that has been reflected with light, especially like on a swimming pool or on a beach. That's what the caustics looks like. And some of these materials look like wood, some of them looks like clouds, some of them look like cells. And guess what? The names of these materials kind of like give you an idea of what they do. If we head over to the patterns category, we can see things like, bricks, hexagonal patterns, things like meshes. These are things like fibers. These are actually kind of like man-made. And under the filters category, these filters pretty much work the same way like Snapchat filters work. So a filter will take in an input and modify that input. So basically, if you have color on your mesh or your texture and you want to remove that color, you can use a desaturate filter to remove the color. You can use a sharpen filter to sharpen up your textures, or you can use a blur filter to blur out your textures. So this is the core technique when you're working with Substance Designer. You're creating a texture from scratch, and you're going to have these texture outputs you can use in an engine like Unreal Engine, in Blender, in 3ds Max, in Maya, or Unity. Right? So basically, that's what you're doing. You're creating and combining these generators, these patterns, these filters, and other special object types in a graph view. This is the graph view, and you're connecting this graph view using a variety of nodes, atomic nodes. You can have your blend modes. Another key concept working with Substance 3D Designer is that it is non-destructive. If I go over here, and let's go back to our plane and just look at our plane right here. If I want to do things like, say, increase the number of sides for this rock shapes right here, we can actually go over here and turn up the number of sides, and we can actually see those changes affecting our rocks parametrically. So we're not destroying anything. We're just changing these parametric values with these sliders. If I set the tiling to 2, like so, we can actually see the effect it's having directly on our object shape. So basically, that's another thing about parameters. It's actually and basically non-destructive. So you can go back at any point, at any step, and recreate any asset you have. Another cool thing about Substance Designer is you can specify your texture size. Here I was using a 1K texture. I can set this to a 2K texture, and depending on the mode, by default it's on the parent mode. So basically, it's what that means is each child will inherit the properties of the parent graph. So if I set the parent graph to be 2048, all subgraph or child graphs are going to have that same resolution. So that's just the basis of what Substance Designer is. It is simply a PBR, a physically based rendered system that allows you to create these nodes, which are a group of texture generators, patterns, noises, filters, and special effects you can connect or chain using a variety of built-in atomic nodes to create your output, which is going to be a final texture output you can use in a game engine, and it's going to react to light. So with that, I've prepared a nice slide. These slides are from the default Adobe website and other places. I've actually extracted this text. So I didn't create this everything entirely from scratch. So this is just the texture guide. So from here, what I'm going to do is to just go over this, and you can have this as a companion PDF slide. I'll have this available, and I'll just quickly go over the slides and what we've talked about right here, and you can have this by the side so that you can use this as a guide when you're working with Substance Designer. Substance Designer is slightly technical, and it's quite challenging for, especially when you're starting out. It's not like Painter, and I'll just forgive me for opening up Painter right now. Designer is not like Painter. Painter is quite similar to Photoshop. Again, it's a parametric non-destructive system, and it has layered stacks. You can stack things on layers, you can work with your brush, and you can actually see these changes directly, right? So that's how Designer works. Again, it also lights up the scene using a HDR, so you can always change your environment scene and see how light is going to affect your scene. So basically that's it. So for instance, we are on this environment map. If I change this map right now and I try to kind of like move the light around, you can actually see we're using this little forest scene to light up this object. So basically it means in your game engine, whatever scene you have, any model you create will react. The light will react with this texture directly. So let's quickly go over this slide, and like I said, I'm going to have this slide available. So again, I explained that PBR is a method of rendering that gives you a representation of what light is. It allows you to create realistic looking assets that react to the lighting system of your environment, so you don't have to recreate the textures for a dark scene or the textures in a cave. And Substance Designer is a software that allows you to create 2D textures, materials, and filters in a non-destructive way, as we've seen in that example. Now, there are some key definitions when you're working with Substance Designer. That's the graph, a model graph, a function graph, and MDL. MDL is a special graph from by NVIDIA, so you might not necessarily need to worry about that specialized tool. Now, the Substance file is Substance SBR file. Basically, if you're using Substance Designer and you export that file, what that means is you have a very lightweight file. You're not exporting full textures. You're exporting instructions embedded in a bit of a file. So it's very light, and then your engine will translate those files to recreate those textures. So that's what you're doing. So this allows you to create very high quality, detailed textures. It gives you an option to change settings like we saw in the example. You could change the size of rocks, you could change the color of a material, you can change how large or small the fabric of a material is. You can do all those things basically by having a small embedded .sbr file. So it's a dynamic texture generator that exposes parameters. You can basically expose a lot of parameters and change those parameters. And the cool thing is the filters or the textures you create in Substance Designer you can use them in Substance Painter and expose those parameters, as well as in Unreal Engine and Unity. So a substance graph is used to create these textures. Basically, your substance graph are the main graphs, and then you're not constrained to resolutions, color or shapes, basically you can always change those graphs. Now this is an example of a simple graph like I've shown you in the other example. So a substance function graph is a slightly technical graph, and what you use with a substance function graph are input values. So you're processing input values rather than image data that has pixels. And basically function graphs, they use node networks where you use nodes, and it's slightly different from your regular substance graph. And this one is, like I said, is more technical, so you use math and values, and basically that's what your function graph do. So this is an example of how your function graph looks like. So an example of a substance graph, you use your shapes, you use your nodes, you use your noises, and you use your parameters as well. So let's just quickly move on. So like I said, a node will move from left to right. That's the direction. So everything you start from the left, any changes you make will be heading towards the right. So for instance, if I have a large texture set here for rocks, and I actually add another texture set for rocks with a variation, and I mix them and I add some color, if I start going back to the left, I'll actually see that the changes are progressively moving to the right. And you can chain nodes into a subgraph to create a smaller node instance. So basically, if I don't want to go back to Designer right now, but basically you can expose a graph and collapse everything into a smaller graph you can now use as an input. So what this means is you can create a texture for a wall, and you can collapse that entire combination. Let's say you have 50 or 100 nodes, you can combine them into a simple subgraph you can now use as an input as your starting point to create other complex graph. So that's basically what instancing is. It allows you to chain your graphs. So parameters, like I explained, can be exposed from your graph instances to change values. For instance, if you have a rock or a grass material and you want to increase the size of the graph, you can expose the size parameter and you can create a slider that allows you to increase or decrease the size of that graph. You can also create parameters to change the color of things. So basically that's what parameters are. And like I explained, an MDL graph stands for a material definition language, and it's an NVIDIA specialized material, and Substance Designer allows you to use a node-based workflow to kind of like make changes and work with materials definition library. So here, texture generators, like I explained, they are nodes that don't require inputs. They generate outputs, and they're categorized into noises and patterns. Noises are much more organic. They are much more natural. They consist of random shapes, and patterns look man-made. So basically these you go ahead and took this from the Substance documentation website, and like I said, this is just a guide for me to always come back to in case I'm getting confused on trying to find out what things are. So I'll just quickly rush through this, and like I said, I actually explained everything, and that brings us to the quick end of the slides. So thank you very much for following along, and I'll see you in the next quick tip.